In the name of Allah, the most gracious, most merciful, peace be upon you again in this session, whereby we'll be talking about the human development and education in the Arab Gulf states. We've got 4 speakers, and every speaker will be talking about one component of this session. We will allocate 15 minutes for every speaker, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. The first speaker is Dr. Israa Watfa. He'll be talking about the development role of education in the Arab Gulf states. Dr. Ali is a professor of educational psychology in both Damascus University and Kuwait University. He's a member of the Arab Writers Union, the Syrian Writers Association, and the Global Network for Human Rights Education, and many other Arab organizations. His books have been widely translated, and his educational research published in Arab and Islamic educational journals. He holds an MA and PhD in educational sociology from Caen University in France. Please, the floor is yours, Dr. Ali. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, brothers and sisters, I would like to salute you, and I would like to thank you for your presence in this afternoon session. I would like to seize this opportunity to extend my gratitude to the ladies and gentlemen, the members of the organizing committee for this conference, because of their generous reception in Qatar. I would like also to extend my gratitude to my brother Dr. Hassan al-Derham, the gentleman who is chairing this session. It is a self-evident theme. It is to do with the development role of education in the Arab Gulf states. I just wanted to criticize this matter, and I wouldn't talk in generic terms. As a matter of fact, the problem that I am floating here is the relationship between the education and development in the GCC, or the Gulf Arab states, as I call them. The relationship between education and development in light of the changes, and there is a question that derives from such a relationship, i.e., does the education in the GCC, or was it up to the standard, or did it keep the pace of the developments that we are witnessing in the GCC, or perhaps did it play an obstructive role or a negative role vis-a-vis development? And in any case, if the answer was yes or no, we will be looking at the changeable elements and the circumstance that might make the education indeed keep the pace with the development, or obstructing it on the other hand. Undoubtedly, I cannot perhaps float all the ideas that cross my mind, but I have the propensity to say that education did not play an education role or a developmental role, and this education is still obstructing the development indeed, and it's obstructing enlightenment and revival. If it starts or if it continues in the same manner, it will pose threat on the social fabric and the economic institutions. I would like to give you a prelude vis-a-vis the nature between the relationship between the two. Historically speaking, there is a golden aphorism that says education is the natural incubator of the secrets of the society, and the things that we cannot translate in the society, we can translate in the education. And that's why the previous societies, when faced with setbacks or problems, they would resort to the education. They would criticize, they would ask educators why we have failed. So they resort to the root causes via the educational channels. I would like to tell you about the following. The first anecdote is indeed enjoyable. When Germany was beaten in 1806 against Napoleon, the Germans felt upset. And then the poet Fichte, he appealed to the German people and he said to them that the defeat was not military one, but it was educational. And he indeed recommended to change the curricula. And indeed the Germans followed his advice, and as you see, they are splendid now in their own country. And there's another anecdote. When France was defeated in the World War II, they had a committee. Paul Langevin was a huge, prominent person in physician matters, or he was a physician, obviously.
دكتورنا رئيس الجلسة معلش مشان أنا أتابع ساعة مدري ساعة يعني أنا على غير متوقع.
Excuse me, the alarm has went off and I do apologize. I didn't expect it. Paul Langevin, he was a scholar in physics and he was on a par with Einstein. What did he decide with his committee? He said that the defeat of France was educational in its core, and he advised the French to change their educational curricula. And this applies also to the Sputnik. In 1969, the USSR has sent the Sputnik, and America was surprised. But they said that the curricula in the Soviet Union was genuine, and that's why they sent experts to study this curriculum in the Soviet Union. At the same time, the Americans attempted to change the curricula, and 12 years later, the United States of America indeed sent a man to descend on the moon through Apollo, the famous Sputnik. And as you know, in 1983, when the performance of the pupils in America retreated in the international exams, Reagan has talked about this matter as if it was the biggest threat. In the 11th of September, the reason of the 11th of September catastrophe was confined to the educational system as well in the Arab world, as the Westerners thought. In 1948, we have been witnessing setbacks and defeats, but still we did not take a pause and we did not take heed of our educational system at all. And this is unfortunate. It is incumbent on us to allude to the fact that the economy, as the central plank of the state, is related to the knowledge-based economy. 75% of the economic growth relies on the ingenuity of humans and the growth in the economy. Japan, for example, and South Korea has no human resources or perhaps natural resources, but they had a quantum leap in their economy. On the contrary, in the Arab world, we do not have a single country that depends on the knowledge or what we call the investment in the human capital. Development in the GCC countries, we need to give you an idea. Most of the studies said that it is structural. It is to do with the stone rather than the humans, and it depends on the institutions, the economic institutions. The human dimension is still not there. And the evidence, there are indeed indexes from the IMF, for example, the 3 economic summits in the GCC country did not take heed of the human dimension, which was not present, and despite the fact that we have witnessed a boom in the indexes of development, albeit these indexes contradict categorically the realities in the Gulf societies by and large. because it is brimful of crises, as you know, imbalances in the demography, and so on and so forth. I hope that you would read this paper because there are plenty of information. Here, we are talking about a human-related crisis. It is nothing to do with economics, or it is a man-made crisis, and this is emblematic of the absence of the development by and large. When it comes to the strategies of development, we can see that investment in the human capital is lacking. There is a boycott in this regard, and people do not take heed in this block. They do not take heed of the human capital. For example, the top-notch people here in the Gulf do not think that education can be an investment in the development, and that's why they resort to economics rather than development, genuine development. We look at the educational advancement as if it was to do with the number of institutions and the number of school pupils. As a matter of fact, these are cosmetics, but when it comes to the core, it is to do with the ideology, the content, the essence, the human image. With this advancement in the structure of the education and the schools, but the development in the human capital is still not present. When it comes to expanding the educational system in the structure, doesn't mean a genuine development. A genuine development ought to be related to the philosophy, to the trends, the patterns, the ideology of the education, and thus it can become revivalist or it can become obstructionist. So would it be possible to say that the GCC countries are conservative, reticent? The indices say yes, they are dealing with the status quo. They obstruct any change in essence and not in the form, in the cosmetic sense of the word. The education system in the Gulf has led to having an elite that is loyal to the regime and having also taken heed of the traditions that are entrenched in these societies. Do we have we played a conservative role in the education? Yes, we do in the Gulf countries. And Mr. Ali Fakhru, who is here, we are honored of having him. He talked about this matter previously. I have counted 14 crises in the educational domain, and they are to do with the politicization, the indoctrination, the crisis of teachers, the crisis that relate to studies. There are 14 crises that relate to the educational domain, indeed, and as a matter of fact, we cannot plumb the depth of these studies, but I'll touch upon them very briefly. These crises are existential indeed, especially when we align them to the education system. The education system in the GCC is still ensnared in this ambush. I would like to focus on the following. Planning, for example, we have noticed that planning is feeble. The implementation of the plans is feeble. There is no philosophy that relates to the education. There are notebooks that are put on the shelves, and I have participated in the formation of such curricula, but they are still lacking the philosophy, lacking the reform. They are lacking the details of solidifying the system. That means that we are spontaneous in our walk. The things are wishy-washy as such, and the philosophy is not there. And that's why we notice that there is a huge risk, what we call the emulation of other examples, the independent schools, the schools of the Ghad, the schools of the future, the educational cities. I do think that if we copy-paste the universities from the West, we could have done so. we could have done the copy and paste from A to Z, and this is wrong. We need to customize these experiences with our needs, but it was lacking. We can notice that the strategic planning fell flat because we couldn't indeed lay off or dispense with the emulation process. We had followed suit and we had indeed followed the West from A to Z in the cars and in the universities. What's the point of having a university from the West and bringing it to the Qatari land? The Qataris are not allowed to teach in such universities. What does that mean if the university is not inherently a Qatari one that relates to the society of the Qataris and the livelihood of them, and if it cannot rehabilitate the Qataris? What do we mean by having these universities? Is it to do with the cosmetics of the land? Politics as well plays a major role in this regard. The schools, for example, ought to be an incubator of politics. The schools are lacking the debate of politics, and more ominous, Bakr Dajjal, for example, has said the ministers of education has become like party-related protectorates. Most of the people who tried to change, they lost their jobs. I mean the Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Those pundits, I don't know whether Dr. Ali Fakhru has lost his position as well. He might have lost it as well. 5 minutes? The chairman is saying 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes. There is something that we call the ideological hegemony. Most of the political trends try to pursue their narrow interest. They bombard them with ideology. What does that mean? It means that people are having to be resorted to ideology rather than intellect. For example, there is a main idea that I want to re-emphasize. Does the school renew the intellectual components of the societies of the GCC countries? You can notice that the culture, the mainstream culture, is to do with the myths, the subordination of women, the patriarchal kind of society, and so on and so forth. It is traditional 100%. It opposes development. The school produces and reproduces all these values, and we cannot see any innovation. The graduates of the universities and the high school resort to the traditions per se, without innovation, without creativity, without change. And more ominous is that this kills the ingenuity of human beings, and most of the educational system in the Gulf follows indoctrination. Indeed, it happens also in the universities. I would like to give you some examples just to touch upon these slides very quickly. Just 1 minute. I'm done. Thank you very much. Thank you for your listening. Thank you, Dr. Ali. I think your prelude was very successful for this session. Every single idea warrants a lecture, perhaps. I would like to move to Dr. Martin Hvidt. He is a professor at the Zayed University in Dubai and formerly an associate professor at the Center for Contemporary Middle East Studies, University of Southern Denmark. For the last decade, his research has focused on the economic development of the Gulf countries. He recently published a paper entitled Economic Diversification in the GCC Countries, Past Record and Future Trends. At the LSE, the London School of Economics. He will be talking about the transformation of the Gulf economies into knowledge-based economies, motivational issues related to the tertiary educational sector. Please.
And first of all, thank you for the organizers to invite me. I'm very honored to be here and share some of my thoughts with you. Basically, I'm going to talk about the transformation of the Arab Gulf states into knowledge economies. We know that every single development report for the region. Every time one of our rulers access the state, they will use the word knowledge economy. And all good research starts in a good question. And basically this time the question is, how do we get there? And this paper is out of actually a project I did together with Georgetown University here on knowledge and on innovation, done through the last year. The paper I'm presenting here is what I call a think piece. There is so much lack of solid data on education. There's so much lack of specific knowledge of the sort of incentives I'm going to talk about, that this is hopefully some ideas which we can discuss, but someone else will have to make the hardcore research one day. What comes out of this is, one of the things, when I wrote this paper was that, I'm a professor at the Zayed University in Dubai. I've been much in and out the region for the last 10 years, and I see a lot of the problems Mr. Ali was just telling us about education. There are strange things when you consider societies that have so much money. Why don't they do their education sector in a slightly different way? That would be one of my thinking. Okay, this is where the article will come, the Muslim World Quarterly. We have 7 articles in there in January about education and innovation in the Gulf, written by various Gulf people and also a couple from outside. Okay, I will say something as an introduction. I'll define the knowledge economy. I will talk about structural issues, basically what Ali Wolfton has just done, and then change into motivational issues. Because I think that one of the reasons, or one of the things we have to look for why there are problems in the educational sector is the incentive by the individual student to actually pursue education. My main argument is the GCC states coming very late into the development game. You would say that the first developers, Britain, in the 1770s, would develop by invention. They would invent things. Many of the other European states and so on in the 18th and 1900s would develop through innovation, meaning they take the invention and transfer it into something useful in another way. While in the Gulf, you've been so late in the development, basically from the oil, time of the oil coming in, that things has been readily available on the shelves, and in this way, you didn't need to innovate, you didn't need to invent things, they were already there. And that has meant something for today's. GCC states bypassed industrialization, and the economic model has led, that's my argument, to an emphasis, lack of emphasis on education, lack of incentives for the young people today to pursue education and to become what we call knowledge workers. I usually take this picture and show it, and because when we think about development, we think about the time horizon. This is Abu Dhabi, and this is in 1955, and that is 3 years before I was born. So I could have been born there, basically. And when you enter the Abu Dhabi today, you will see the market different. So it's a 50-year time span. Knowledge economy, society where knowledge, skills, innovation, potential are the key resource. Don't need to go much into this. Knowledge economy is the latest stage in the capitalist society. It affects all sectors in society, and the aim is to increase competition among states and cities worldwide. And in defining it, people would say that a knowledge economy is not here dealing with the amount of people educated. it is not only about advancements in natural sciences and mathematics. A lot of people think knowledge economy is or is natural sciences. But it's more broadly about, as I write there, a general entrepreneurial spirit that can identify problems and solve them. Right? Starbucks is one of the best examples of a knowledge economy. Take the old concept of coffee, drinking coffee, and turn it into something new. That is basically what the knowledge economy is about. Stiglitz would say what we really need for a knowledge economy is a different kind of culture where motivation, aspirations, entrepreneurship becomes intrinsic ethos of the individual. So the individual is the key. Knowledge economy defined by World Bank, 4 things: economic incentives, regimes, innovation, education, and information technology. And the good point is that the GCC states does very well when it comes to policy environment and to IT technology, but they significantly underperform in relation to education. That's basically the point you also had, and innovation. There are some statistics we can't go into, but just one interesting one here. This is patents. I made an excerpt of the database for patents. And what is interesting is that the Gulf states, some GCC, 49 patents, 81, so on, an average for the last 5 years of 162 patents a year. Saudi Arabia, most of them. And if you go back all the way to 1963, where this system was set up, to 1,200, nearly 1,300 patents is granted for this region. However, 5.5 million patents has been issued worldwide. Every year, around 230,000 patents are issued. And so in this measurement, which is one of the typical ones being done in the knowledge economy, there's not many patents. There's very, very few actually coming out of this region every year. Talking about structural challenges, if we review all the literature, at least in English, I'm not so good in Arabic, that has to do with the educational standard in the Gulf. Some of the UNDP reports, the Arab knowledge reports written by Arabs, World Bank reports, a lot of smaller reports, and these TIMSS and PISA assessments, they all basically produce the same picture. Educational system in GCC is not working very well. Research, educational capacity is low, and education and economic performance of the economy is very weak. As we all know who are in the research sector here, the funding for research, despite the many petrodollars, is very low. Only 0.2% of GDP. Germany uses 3.3%, Japan 3.5%, EU in general 2% of GDP. Lack of research focus at universities, high teaching loads, that's at least what we see in a federal university in UAE. Lack of social science-based research and teaching research, which to some degree is not a part of production in society. And the reports again would say, a lot of the educations in this part of the world was developed before there was actually a need for it. So there's a weak link between what the education is doing and what the needs are in society. And basically, it all comes into the fact of the oil economies. There's a guy called Gilferson who has made a very large study on oil economies and who will say that in most societies where oil incomes are large, a large percent of GDP, the focus on education is low. The second part of my paper now is on the motivational challenges, because all of this, I think, it's relatively easy to read all the reports and get this understanding. But my point and my added value in this paper, I think, is to say that we need to focus on the motivational issues. And I'm treading dangerous ground here, but my logic is that human resources are tied to the individual, and as such can only be unlocked if the individual is willing to do so. And the way we unlock it in an economic sense is by incentives. If you give me very good incentives to do something, I might do it. If you don't give me incentives, I might not do it. So in this way, it might be the picture I'm gonna give you here is that many of the young ones in this region, young people, at least the students I see in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, they don't seem like they have a very strong incentives to pursue education. And I'm asking why. But it's not let me be very straight. I'm not saying that Arab youth is unengaged, spoiled, or lazy. I'm saying that the incentive structure they are embedded in does not provide them incentives to work as hard as they should at university level. Incentives for me comes in these, that at least the ones I study: structure of the economy, intergenerational learning, expat labor, professional development track. The first one is easily comprehensible. The oil. Before oil, these societies were completely different, have completely different incentives, but with oil coming in, we get distributional states, some would call them rentier states, differences between, I get a letter here, oh, I got 10 minutes, thank you. No, 5, Khamsa. The effect of oil, rentier states. Oil is unearned money, got a lot of them. A lot of people have been writing about this. If you break the relationship between work, effort, and reward, you destroy the incentive structures. It's called the rentier mentality. So, my students, as I write in the bottom here, they feel every time I teach, I ask my students in every course, do you feel confident you'll get a job? Yes, everyone does. They can basically raise their hands and they will get a job in the public sector. And they like the public sector because it's good working hours and good pay and so on. Even the ones with the lowest grade point average feel they will get a job. I have 3 kids in Denmark. They're in university, 2 of them. They don't feel secure they will get a job unless they study hard and sort of bring themselves in front of the queue, right? So I think there is an issue here with societies with a lot of money. The second thing is intergenerational learning. It's a set of theories. It's complicated, but it means basically that what can your parent generation teach you? We have to be careful because we talk about averages, right? Generally, if you have a parent generation who was weakly educated, and most of the kids young people in universities and so on, are not the product of families who has been working in industries for generations. There might be a different signal you send to these young people. Do you teach them all the skills? Raise early in the morning, work very hard, show initiative. Do you have a forward-looking attitude? These things might be difficult if you have a parent generation that maybe are not only a part of it, only a smaller part of it, are working and need to work in order to make knowledge. It's a complicated argument. I'll not go further, but there are some issues what we instill in our next generation. If you have not been through a sort of industrialization period where everyone would learn to watch the clock. The third element would be expat labor. My students very, very often tells us, yes, we want a job, but we will not compete with the expats. Some of them say we can't. I mean, I could never be, some of them would say, an accountant who could compete with an Indian accountant who's worked in accounting all life. Yes. So there's an issue there. And the final one of the four is that, God forbid, upward mobility in public sector job is usually confined to promotion within management tracks. Meaning, if you're in Switzerland, you are a hero if you are a very good watchmaker, right? Engineer. You can move a career all your life being a good engineer. Here, the people I know, also basically from Qatar, they will say, no, if I have a good engineer, he's a manager, they will only stay with me 3 years, because then they will move into a management job, which has only remotely something to do with engineering, and then they will be out. Because there's no development, you cannot be promoted in the system. So, finish. I explored some challenges. I know it's a broad picture. Conclusion is oil has destroyed an incentive structure. The incentive structure was there earlier. Oil destroyed it, and now we have to get it back. Practical implications would see that improving schools, building new universities, and so on is not enough. In one way, you will have to instill the incentive to work in the young generation here, and you'll probably be in a much better position to say how this should be done. One of the things, yes. Thank you very much. These were the points.
Thank you very much, Dr. Martin. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا جزيلا.
المتحدثة.
Thank you very much. We'll move to
أستاذة إسراء بطاينة.
Israa Batayneh.
وظيفة باحثة.
On Israa, she is an assistant research at the General Opinion Project at this center, and she worked also in the researches and polls at the Jordanian University. She has graduated from Sheffield, and she has an MA as well in English literature from the Jordanian University. Israa will be talking on behalf of Dr. Dima Jamali, who is the Professor of Management and Gamal Endowed Chair in Responsible Leadership in the Alliance School of Business and the American University of Beirut, and she holds a PhD in Social Policy and Administration from the University of Kent at Canterbury in the UK. And the lady will be talking about the corporate social responsibility in oil and gas companies. Yes, please.
سوف أقدم الورقة باللغة الإنجليزية كما أرسلتها الدكتورة دينا الجمالي بعنوان Corporate Social Responsibility in Oil and Gas Companies. Oil and gas companies have been at the center of recent corporate social responsibility developments and well known for their active engagement in CSR activities compared to companies in other sectors. This is mostly due to the massive visible negative externalities of the oil and gas sector and identified potential implications of demographic, economic, and infrastructure variables. In fact, oil extraction operations are a threat to the environment at every stage of the supply chain, from exploration and production to transportation and refining. Extractive industries have been blamed for distorting national economies, undermining good governance, and negatively impacting local communities, contributing to community fragmentation. This is particularly accentuated in the context of developing countries where government's capacity is weak and lines of responsibility and accountability between government and gas companies tend to be blurred. With the advent of oil and gas companies, claims and demands for local and municipal services invariably increase, putting a strain on local government and infrastructure. The capital investment brought to local areas by oil companies often counterbalanced by the manifold negative externalities can lead to a high politicized environment. Particularly with the ascendancy of CSR, residents of the host community have escalated expectations of oil and gas companies, particularly in the developing world. Furthermore, the interaction between oil and gas companies and local communities during resource extraction can lead to increased demands on oil and gas companies to invest in the development of the local communities. Resource-rich countries should be particularly sensitized to managing the impacts of oil and gas companies, requiring them to reduce their negative impacts and demonstrating genuine CSR. Oil and gas companies are thus under intense scrutiny and pressure to be more accountable and to report publicly on their social and environmental performance. Dr. Dima's paper discusses the manifold potential impacts of oil and gas companies in countries in which they set shop. The paper presents a brief overview of CSR in the Middle East, providing examples of CSR initiatives specific to oil and gas companies in the context of Arab countries, then concluding with recommendations on avenues for taking CSR forward, with particular focus on oil and gas companies operating in the region. Starting with the impact of oil and gas companies, the impact of extractive companies has been quite evident and highlighted in the literature. The oil and gas industry invariably causes changes in the societies in which it operates, from unintended oil spills and leakages to unexpected explosions. Oil and gas companies are known to be major contributors to environmental degradation through the years. Affecting ecosystems and climate change, oil and gas companies jeopardize the health and quality of life of communities through atmospheric pollution, solid waste, heavy metals, and more. Due to oil spills, fertile and cultivable land can be destroyed, and marine life and health may be affected. Food security may be jeopardized as well, which in turn undermines the livelihood of communities dependent on the after-mentioned sources of living. Moreover, oil in its crude form contains different chemicals which affect toxically. This creates fears and apprehensions with the communities affected. The literature has documented the manifold potential impact of oil and gas companies in societies in which they operate. This is reflected in turn through a range of demonstrations and increased violence in areas where oil and gas companies operate, such as hostage-taking, pipeline sabotage, blocking oil rigs, shutting down flow stations, leading to deadly shootout with security operations. This is coupled with negligence from the side of government in some countries, where dependence on oil revenues has discouraged the enforcement of existing environmental regulations. Dr. Jamali mentioned the example in the Niger Delta region, where the federal government cannot afford to say or do anything that would discourage the operations of the oil firms. Moreover, the government is reluctant to depend on non-oil tax revenues to finance its activities. With that, CSR initiatives examples in the Arab region, focusing on the oil and gas companies. The CSR has enjoyed a global ascendancy in recent years. McWilliams and Siegel define CSR as actions that appear to further some social good beyond interest of the firm, that which is required by law. Quote. CSR has also picked up momentum and seems to be advancing across the Middle East. Although it holds its unique flavor stemming from a culture of philanthropy and charity which are deeply enriched across the region. Charity is not a new concept in the Middle East. One main reason is that Islam mandates donating to the poor and helping the underprivileged through zakah. However, the recent uprisings and escalating social needs across the MENA region, traditional philanthropy is starting to cross-fertilize with new advances pertaining to CSR in the region, and many companies are trying to move beyond arm's length philanthropy to more systematic and institutionalized forms of giving embodied in notions of CSR. Oil and gas companies have been known to secure the social license to operate via CSR initiatives. Their CSR initiatives address environmental concerns and local community issues, including health, education, and infrastructure projects. A cursory look across the region highlights remarkable progress in the domain of CSR across industries, including the petrochemicals and other oil-related industries, with CSR going well beyond charity and philanthropy to encompass the triple bottom line of economic, social, and environmental responsibilities. Considering the CSR activities of some of the key oil and gas companies across the region, it is clear that there is still a philanthropic thread, but also that they touch on various dimensions pertaining to the triple bottom line, including a focus on environment, education, health and safety, and the development for local communities. Dr. Jamal here illustrates few examples from the Arab region, namely from Qatar Petrochemical Company, Qatar Petroleum, and from other countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. However, while oil and gas companies are doing enough in terms of CSR is debatable. In fact, there is a common concern that multinational oil and gas companies may be replacing CSR projects across the board without sufficient tailoring to the needs and realities of the local context, hence disregarding the community's perceived needs, which has the potential to breed conflict and controversy. This is potentially serious and problematic, and as it can lead to an escalation in conflict and disruption of communication if the community perceives CSR as standardized, dysfunctional, or not adequately rooted in community needs or the realities of the local context. So how to take CSR forward? Across the Middle East, we need to push forward with significant advancement in CSR and further institutionalization, integration, and outcome assessment. While preserving the original social values and long traditions of philanthropy across the region, there is room to mobilize resources more effectively in facilitating social change through effective CSR. Dr. Jamal explores 4 recommendations for taking CSR forward in the oil and gas sector. Firstly, to design meaningful CSR programs based on dialogue and a better understanding of the realities and peculiarities of the local context. Secondly, developing CSR programs based on effective stakeholder engagement and materiality management. Thirdly, encouraging public sector engagement and oversight in relation to priority CSR areas. And lastly, exploring different forms of partnership to take CSR forward in oil and gas sector to the level of effective enactment and shared value creation. as Dr. goes deeply in these 4 recommendations, we'll jump to the conclusions due to the time. Her concluding remarks basically that oil and gas corporations are thought to engage in CSR activities with the aim to soothe enraged host communities in relation to their manifold negative externalities and impacts. Increasingly, these companies are recognize the importance of bottom-up development planning, where active engagement rather than just input of host communities is solicited. In fact, these companies, in order to sustain, should elicit ways for constructive dialogue, the appeasing of concern, and the peaceful resolution of conflicts. Oil and gas companies that wish to be CSR leaders in this field should take into account the local context in which they operate, engage in dialogue with their host communities, and incorporate community concerns and needs to the heart of their CSR policies and interventions. There is also room in the particular environment of the Middle East region at this juncture of various forms of CSR partnerships that are voluntary, consensual, multi-sectorial, and grounded in shared objectives. This is the only way that oil and gas companies can potentially elevate their manifold negative externalities and generate long-term benefits and added value for the countries and societies in which they set operations. The participation and oversight of the public sector also emerges as the key to keep oil and gas companies on track in terms of delivering rather than detracting long-term social and economic value in their various countries of operations. These new forms of partnership, they cross-fertilize the efforts of private, public, and non-governmental partners will be beneficial in taking CSR in the Middle East forward to the next level of institutionalization, enactment, and shared value creation. Thank you.
شكرا دكتورة إسراء.
Thank you, Dr. Israa. Our next speaker is Lulwa Rashed al-Khater, and Lulwa is the head of quality assurance at Tourist Commission. Formerly, she used to work with RAND and in the fields of education, and she has an MA from Imperial College in London. Lulwa will be presenting on how policy formation in Qatar, the case of K-12 education reform. In the name of God, first of all, I would like to thank the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies for inviting me. I thank you, Dr. Hassan al-Derham. How public policy is made in Qatar, the approaches can be different, but I have chosen one particular policy, and through studying it and assessing it to form a picture, and the case of K-12 education reform is the topic I've chosen. This is a study on policy formation, and quite simply the first research question is what processes determine each phase of policy making? Secondly, second point, who are the players in each phase? And also the framework, the theoretical framework are relied on historical institutionalism and rational choice institutionalism. In fact, the context of this paper is based on the idea that over 20 years of education reform attempts are many, but I'll focus on the independent schools that Dr. Ali has alluded to. This started with a study in 2001 by the RAND organization commissioned by the government of Qatar, and they are similar to the chartered school systems in the United States and other countries. For lack of time, I'll focus on two aspects of this. First of all is the ideation of policies and their implementation. Secondly, fluidity and solidity in the decision-making process. Policies between ideation and implementation. Old institutionalism meant recognizing formal, legal, and materialistic structures and not paying enough attention on the values and the interaction with the environment. The new institutionalism, which was developed mainly in the 80s of last century, started to stress the importance of ideas and the social dimension. The second point I want to mention is that the transformation from designing policy on paper means instilling these ideas in organizations. The problem is these institutions, whether formal or not formal, sometimes give these policies features which were not included there and was not intended by the policymakers. This is what we call institutional determinism. As we said, the value side is very important, as we said. We want to know what is the embedded value model here. We talk about independent schools. People focus on why teaching language is in English. Now we're back to Arabic, by the way. Or they talk about the hours allocated to Sharia studies and religious studies. Sometimes these can be embedded. For example, consumerism can be Islamized. Instead of consuming goods at Christmas time, we use it in Ramadan, for example. As the charter schools definition in the USA, there are schools of choice that are economic in nature. They do not represent any methodology or philosophy, and all the philosophers behind it are Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and others, but the famous economist and defender of capitalism, Milton Friedman, is the famous ones who crystallized the idea and focusing on the fact that schools are profit-making entities operating in a free market. The good ones will survive, the bad ones will either correct themselves or lose out. And John Stuart Mill says that if the government would make up its mind to require for every child a good education, it might save itself providing one, etc., etc. And through this, we look at school as part and parcel of the market economy. And the empirical studies so far do not prove that charter schools are performing better than other government schools. This is a study performed by RAND organization. The other point I want to allude to here is the fact that there are a number of cheating scandals as schools were pressured to deliver to the standards. In Qatar, however, independent schools started in 2001. In 2002, the Supreme Council for Education was established, 2004 saw the first cohort of secondary schools, and in 2001 was so the Ministry of Education was dissolved and integrated into the Supreme Council for Education, and we started seeing very clearly a return to central thinking, to a central curriculum, unified curriculum, to textbooks, and which meant reversing the policies adopted previously. And this is the old model, like a pyramid, and the dark side to the left, and on the right side, the white side of the slide was according to the new initiative. The question here is, how can we create a non-centralized system in a system which is already centralized? All the government structures are like a central pyramid. So the question is the imperative of the design application variances. This is a published study, by the way. You can have a look at. Was this inevitable? People seem to be of the opinion that any design is wonderful, but the application is bad. Some people's performance was not up to standard. The argument I'm trying to make here is that the variables, the changes were inevitable. This is not just a question of individuals applying the design. These were structural, intrinsic to the system itself. So what are the proofs for this? Very simply, we will see in the white side of the slide. This is a traditional basic model for education. A number of educators try to, through pedagogical methods, try to reach good output. But on the other hand, the rational choice model means you're not talking about educators here, we're talking about operators. The term itself says a lot. So if we say there is no problem with terminology, you can use what you like, we can say that on the white side of the paper, of the slide, the model is very simple. The other one, in comparison, is more complex because it involves other things like governance. And look at the white side of the slide. The higher objective here is good output. Look at the black side. The good outputs have become a means and not an end in themselves. So therefore, this is an issue which merits a lot of thinking when the quality of education becomes a means, not an end. The problem is as follows, and I got this from the rational choice theory. The theory says there is no one way of maximizing benefits. In other words, operators do not have to improve education to increase the margin of profit. They can reduce costs. For example, instead of getting a teacher who gets a salary of 20,000, we get one who will accept 10,000. I made 16 interviews from 6 schools. They all spoke of one problem, that schools now, that I'm sorry, I'm talking in terms of like market economy about education system. They speak about schools as a profit-making tool. When there's something called gaming the system, I don't know if I have enough time or not to give an example here. I have 2 slides left. Robert Kaplan, who is a famous Harvard professor who invented the balanced scorecard. 3 weeks ago, he came here to Doha and he talked about Atlanta public schools. He says these schools wanted to improve their performance, so they reached out to the private sector and used the balanced scorecards, and this meant a huge improvement in the performance, so much so that Kaplan wrote a book called Administrator, and saying that the tools by the private sector are not only exclusively for the private sector, but they can be used to improve the output of education systems. It says that years later they discovered that all these wonderful results were nothing but cheating on behalf of the teachers, and they admitted that they were under huge pressures and market economy pressures, etc., which led them into cheating. So I know this is, in America, we don't want to say about what happens here in this country, but there is more than one way to maximize the benefits, and because in reality things are not so simple. So therefore, in conclusion, from all these examples, I want to say that foreign advisors and consultants deal with designs on paper as if they can be implemented in reality with no problems at all, as if they're implemented in a vacuum. But I'll give a simple example. When we had the initiative of new education for a new era and required the establishment of the Supreme Council for Education, without talking about the Ministry of Education, which is the oldest bureaucratic system, the oldest ministry. They thought as if they can establish the new institution in a vacuum. Years later, they discovered that there are thousands of people who earn their living from or through the Ministry of Education. They invented a new scheme called early retirement. They suddenly discovered that the schools have lost all the local employees, the Qataris. This caused a lot of anger in society, and this anger was directed towards the independent school system. Now we return the early retirees back to work after years away from the education system. This is because they deal with our societies as if there is total vacuum for them to operate. I have only 2 more slides. So on the one hand, we should talk about continuity and change in policy formation. This is a very wide subject, but we focus on one system, that is the subsystem. When can we achieve continuity? We can achieve it when there is stability in an institution, so that decision-making becomes in the hands of a certain group of bureaucrats who operate away from change and interaction. When can change take place? The change can happen when we open a window between economic, political, social changes, and these bureaucrats For example, when the media starts writing about this institution, they begin to interact with it and things begin to change. Or if there is austerity measures applied in the country. This is what happened in Qatar. The subsystem was the Ministry of Education. I think there is a change in the big circle is the Ministry of Education. The two smaller ones are the Ministry of Education and Supreme Council for Education. The other circles represent the council, schools, ministry, parents, etc. The system, which was stable, had a new actor, and that is the Supreme Council for Education, which means the institution began to lose some of its staff or members, experts, etc. So quite simply, this disintegration and dismantlement means the Ministry of Education was the nucleus for education and the solidity in the education system. With the Supreme Council for Education means we discovered that we discover one theme, one subject like scientific English. We spend a lot of time on it, only to cancel it a few months later and began fresh again. This is something you cannot always blame on individuals' performances, but this is because the disintegration of solid institutions placed by more fluid ones. I conclude by saying that this fluidity will continue for at least 4 more years, and thank you for your kind attention.
We open the floor for a Q&A. Dr. Ali, please. Mr. Chairman, this is an extremely important and serious theme. Unfortunately, the time is limited. I wouldn't comment on the external factors that affect the education. Things are prickly, they are very complicated politically, economically and socially. In the Arab world, everything is complicated and it affects the education system. But I would like to talk about 2 internal issues whereby we can resort to. I think that we need to be professional. We need to professionalize the education system. We have an experience in Bahrain. You can send me your details. I can send you an email talking about this summary of this experience. We need to focus on the teacher. The teacher is the core of the education. It's nothing to do with the rent, nothing to do with the Ministry of Education. Teachers ought to be rehabilitated. You cannot talk about the teacher-centered education currently using the Arab teachers nowadays. There are very important issues that relate to the teacher. That's why I'm one of those who believe that the teachers ought to be rehabilitated first at university, and then they need to have educational background that is thorough, deep, and not superficial. They need to be academically wise. In addition to that, they need to have a general knowledge background information so that they can be cultivated rather than just a teacher that can train and indoctrinate. He or she ought to have also a training background on a path of medicine. That means he or she, the teachers, need to be mentored by veterans in the educational sector so that they can become good teachers. And later on, these rehabilitated teachers ought to be professionalized. They can resemble the core of the education system. They can put conditions of entering such a profession and exiting, and I think this issue is contentious when it comes to the literature of the education, but I think that when it comes to medicine, when medicine has been transformed into a profession, a proper profession, we have moved from ordinary medicine into modernized medicine that is capable of solving the problems. I would like to say that Milton Friedman, and we know that he is the father of the free market economy and the savage capitalism or the greedy capitalism. I think they are far detached from us, and I can give you plenty of books that criticize Friedman and the Chicago school. I would like also to tell you something else. The issue of the school, if we want to make the school an independent educational unit, this is very important. We have tried it in Bahrain, and especially when I was a minister, and we were successful, whereby the school can be governed by a council rather than a principal or a head teacher. So the ministry can have the headlines of the policies, but being innovative and amending this policy comes from the school itself. When you say that you are an independent school, you are an independent unit that can activate such matters. There are plenty of issues. I cannot go through them because of time restraints, but what I would like to re-emphasize is the national issue. Any curriculum that does not take heed of the language, whereby the graduates can use their own native language eloquently and in an articulate manner, not in a second rank after English and French, but in an eloquent manner, and whereby they can relate themselves to culture. Those graduates who cannot speak proper Arabic, who cannot be cultivated, then things will go pear-shaped. These two components are very important. Unless we emphasize the language and the culture, then things will be a failure. Sorry for taking much of your time. I know that the subject is wide enough. Yes, please. Abdullah al-Brady from Al-Qasim University. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Ali Watfa. As a matter of fact, he was very courageous in his presentation. I think that we have to emphasize the project of civilization. We cannot have an education without having a civilized project. The GCC countries, or perhaps any Arab country, we all do not have a national project. We do not have a civilized project. This is not a new thing, but we need to convince the elite and the rulers to adopt a national project that can be customized in accordance with our needs in order to follow the parameters and the political parameters that we follow. This is first. And second, there are funds in the Gulf countries, but the problem lies in the problem of electing those who pull the strings of things. That means the Gulf countries ought to have a mechanism whereby these countries can select bureaucrats, technocrats, those who are capable of putting things into perspective. And they can be loyal, politically speaking. We can't just resort to being loyal politically and turn a blind eye on the other skills. Dr. Martin, we need to differentiate between the motivation, the urge, the impetus, and the funds. I think that the absence of the project is the problem, because we would pursue such projects and we depend on some of the impetus rather than the full range of the impetus and the motivation. Starbucks, you have touched upon them as a knowledge-based example. I would like to commend Mrs. Lulwa Rashed paper. It was nice. Your Arabic was splendid. I would like to thank you. And the methodology that you have followed was excellent. And lastly, I would like to emphasize the seriousness of always stretching out and teaching, or perhaps reaching out for the foreign experts. When a merchant in Saudi Arabia brought a German expert, and at the end of the day he wanted to put a feasibility study, but then the merchant actually was advised to have a club in that town in Saudi Arabia. That was the advice of the German expert. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, Khalid al-Aswar, I'm a researcher. The respectable lady, Israa, she is a researcher at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and she is from Jordan, and she is here in a conference in an Arab land, and I was actually surprised for the lady to speak in English. Sorry, doctor. Sorry, doctor, if you could talk about the paper. If this took place in France, then perhaps the conference will have ended. No, I want to explain, Mr. Khalid, the paper is for Dr. Dima. This is a moral obligation because it was written in English. As I said, it's a moral obligation. The paper was written in English, that's why I said in English. Halima from Qatar University, Dr. Ali, he talked about emulating the educational examples from abroad. We have been studying a Western product. It is natural to resort to the sources, the Western sources. At university we study, and at home we nurture ourselves in Arabic and so on and so forth. There's no alternative, because the West has been laying down the Western knowledge in this regard, so why don't we resort to it? Last question, please. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, most merciful. As a matter of fact, when we talk about the educational crisis in the Arab world, especially now in the Gulf countries, we reiterate and we re-say the things that we said in the past. In the previous conferences, we have huge budgets and we have funds in the GCC, albeit we still facing a dead end, a stalemate position. I would like to give you some examples. Sometimes a man will have, for example, a kitchen that is perhaps the politician would like to have the best cooking books or recipes to have a good meal, but at the end of the day the meal was not up to the standards, so he thought that he would bring cook or a chef. And then we discovered that there are limited capabilities in this kitchen. And then when we had all the tools put in place, we thought that the stove is not working, so the meal can be ready. What I mean is that if we didn't have priorities, if the politicians and everyone, if they do not think that the education is at top of our priorities, then things will be a failure. If the security person or the politician or those who deal with economics think from different point of views, then the education system will be distracted, it will be distorted. And as you know, all across the globe, the education system is at the top of the priority so that we can have useful members of society. We'll pass the floor Dr. Ali first. If you could allow me, Doctor, I do agree with you, Dr. Ali, but perhaps the education, the teacher-centered education is one part of the education. The education is a huge system. I think we need to talk about the objectives, the curriculum, the methods, the education policies, the teachers and the pupils. And if we do not reform the matter, then we will fall flat. We need a radical reform indeed. I do agree with Dr. Abdullah. The gentleman was eloquent in his intervention, and I do remind you, when it comes to Arabic language, in Vietnam used to follow the French language. The elite followed the French language. Ho Chi Minh, the president of Vietnam, asked those in charge of universities, he said to them, you need to use the Vietnamese language. They objected. He said to them, this year you have a space to maneuver, but next year you will have to teach in Vietnam. So now Vietnamese language is ubiquitous and everything is taught by Vietnamese. There's only one I would like to answer. When it comes to the elite's discourse, this is a very important question. When it comes to the elite, they play a major role, but the criticism is not there because the rulers do not know what's happening. There are exaggerations of the achievements. There are some people who jump on the bandwagon. There are some issues that are lacking. The criticism that I talked about doesn't reach the ears of the rulers. So, thank you. I wanted to perhaps talk further, but no, you can do that. In terms of the science and the literature, actually this has been a different matter because we borrowed it from the colonizing power. We have this dichotomy in the Arab world. There's nothing that relates to humanities or literature. There is scientific, everything else has become scientific. And this applies to the high school and the vocational training also. It is to do with the curriculum. Thank you. Mr. Martin.
Just very shortly from my side, I think it's enormously interesting to hear the different viewpoints and the panelists talk about these things. I'll only add one thing, because that was a slide I missed. My suggestion, if I have a small policy suggestion, would be to spend much more emphasis on the primary school. There's evidence, I think, worldwide in the literature that the best money you can ever spend in education is to spend it the first 10 years. Right? And then, you know, whatever you do with the universities is something else. But spend the money there and, yeah.
شكرا دكتور مارتن. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. At the end, we think that it is a system that ought to be integrated. It needs to be treated in a holistic manner. Unfortunately, 70 years after the oil boom, we still depend on the Western technology in exploration and the refinery and so on and so forth. We have the biggest companies, but still, when it comes to technology, we're still backward. Statoil, for example, the Norwegian company, had started in the 70s, but and depending on itself in spreading the knowledge. They have the knowledge now and they exporting it, but we have these companies, but still depend on the other in running such companies. Perhaps it is to do with complicated issues, like Dr. Ali has said, but education is very important. Thank you very much for your interaction, and we hope you every single success. We'll move now to lunch in the al-Mukhtasar hall. When you go out from this hall, you turn right. Thank you very much indeed, and happy appetite.